So I've been asked to do a video on my thoughts of zero-hour contracts by some of our viewers. I like to try and get all of the facts from both sides of the story first before formulating an opinion. So in this video, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So here goes. Okay, so if you haven't watched our videos before, we do videos aimed to help employees. And that's employees either in employment or those seeking employment. Our channel's about trying to be honest, trying to be real, not being afraid, I guess, to give an opinion, which is going to be kind of the subject around this particular video. So 0-hour contracts. Are they really all that bad? Firstly though, let's define what 0-hour contracts are. So a 0-hour contract in the UK is considered a flexible working option, whereby an employer can call upon their employee who is on a 0-hour contract to come and do a job as and when they require, for as little or as long as they need, without having to guarantee any hours whatsoever. I think that's a good definition. Otherwise, the rest of this video is going to be really hard to understand. So think of a 0-hour contract a bit like having a car on the driveway when you work from home. The option presents itself and is available to you as and when you need it. Now, 0-hour contracts aren't actually anything new. Although they've come to more prevalence in recent times, they've actually been around for a few decades now. Before 1998, 0-hour contracts were predominantly only used in the hospitality sector. Not exclusively, but generally that was where you saw them. And the way they typically worked before 1998 was if you had, let's say, a worker who happened to live in a hotel at the same time, and that was how it worked, then the employer would then be able to call upon them as and when they wanted and give them hours. But because they lived in a hotel, they were able to have that flexibility as and when they needed. But two things happened in 1998 and 1999 that changed all this. They were the National Minimum Wage Act and National Minimum Wage Regulations. And before these legal introductions, it was all pretty informal, really. Think of it a bit more like a clock in, clock out system, but you were available, you're on standby at all times. And in fact, the term 0-hour contract, it wasn't really used. That name, well, it came a bit later on. Instead, it was referred to as being on standby or being on call. But between the end of the 1990s and the year 2015, 0-hour contracts as we've come to know them became a lot more prevalent. In 2015, another legal case changed things again. Before this legal case in 2015, virtually all of the power lay in the hands of the employer. The case itself centred around something called inequality of bargaining power. What this means in simple terms is that the employees had no power over their own contracts. All of the power, all of the bargaining, everything, it was all in the hands of the employer. And this case, well, it changed all that. Believe it or not, before this case took place, any employee that refused to take on hours when asked to do so by their employer could actually be disciplined or even fired. And that had happened on occasion. With this particular case centred around that of a security guard, well, it made sure the score got levelled. From that point onwards, workers could refuse hours if they so wished when on a 0-hour contract. You'd be forgiven for thinking, well, with that solved things, that's levelled the playing field. But you'd be wrong. Whilst in theory that legal case itself worked because it levelled the playing field for employees, it created another problem. You see, up until that point, if an employer wanted a 0-hour contract worker to work for them as and when they wanted, that employee basically had to come running, otherwise they would face disciplinary action or even being fired. But after that legal case, well, that wasn't the case. That employee could pick and choose when they wanted to work, and sounds great, right? But from an employer's perspective, you still had a problem. If you needed, therefore, a worker and now all of a sudden they could refuse to do hours at that point, you wouldn't have anyone to do it. So the solution that employers took was to simply hire more 0-hour contract people. And this meant that they again had the power. So if you were one of those employees that wanted the freedom to work as and when you wanted, didn't want to be in the beck and call of your employer, great, you'd got your wish. But it also meant that when you did want to work, unfortunately, you didn't necessarily have the option of being able to go to work. All the employers were doing was giving all of the hours to the 0-hour contract workers that said yes every time they were offered. And if you're one of those people who'd given them a bit of trouble and said no on occasion, they just wouldn't offer you any hours anymore. So, ironically, by winning the case, they kind of shot themselves in the foot. It's a bit like trying to solve the problem of putting out fire by chucking petrol on it. Throughout the years, there's actually been a number of other legal cases surrounding the subject of 0-hour contracts. But much along the same lines as this particular legal case where it solved one problem only to go on and cause another, those other legal cases well, they very much went along the same theme. But hang on a minute, there's always two sides to every story. And I don't just want to look at this and think that all employers are villains and all employees are victims, because there is another side to the story. So let's look at that angle. And to start off, let's be clear. Not all jobs need to be done for a set amount of guaranteed hours. For example, if you need a gardener to go and water your plants in the garden, well, you're not going to need that done if it's bucketing down with rain, are you? So it seems only fair to me that some employers actually need someone on a 0-hour contract. They don't have the work there to guarantee a set amount of hours, and they need that flexibility to have someone available as and when they need them. After all, that's why 0-hour contracts came about in the first place. It gives flexibility to employers. Therefore, I understand why 0-hour contracts have come about. In order to do this video, we've had to do quite a bit of research ourselves on the subject of 0-hour contracts. But ironically, there isn't actually a problem from what we can see with 0-hour contracts themselves. They work, they're perfectly fine, there's a logic behind them. The problems come from the arrangement between the two parties in question, not the concept itself. If you're an employee who's got bills to pay, you're going to want some form of guaranteed income. Otherwise, how are you going to pay for stuff? You're also going to want fair and equal treatment, and you're not going to want hassle and stress to make your life harder. So you're either going to take a 0-hour contract because it offers you the flexibility you need in your lifestyle, or because it's all you can actually get. But what if you're an employer? An employer is just going to want the flexibility to have an available worker as and when they need them. Either for financial or practical reasons, they just can't justify having someone on a guaranteed minimum amount of hours. And they too don't want to be messed around. They don't want to have stress in their life. They just want to get on and have what they need when they need it. So, as for my honest opinion, if I'm taking all of this into account, I actually agree with the concept. I think it's a good idea. And if everybody plays their part in that process, I think 0-hour contracts are a perfectly good idea. But what goes wrong with 0-hour contracts is one of two things. It's unscrupulous employers taking advantage of people in vulnerable positions and bullying their way through to get what they want. And unfortunately, I'd imagine many of the people that are watching this video that have been on a 0-hour contract would have sadly experienced that very thing. That's probably why you're watching it and wanted to see what I'm going to say about it. Sorry to say, but it's not the employers who are always the villains here. On many occasions, it's the employees themselves. You see, I regularly get messed around by candidates. My guys get messed around by candidates. If we're introducing people to companies that we know are good employers that look after people and they're getting messed around, well, it means to say, and it only goes on to demonstrate that if there are victims and villains in the employer circle, well, there are victims and villains towards the employees as well. Not everyone's going to be a saint. It's very frustrating when you deal with a candidate and they point blank lie to you. They sound great, they tell you all the right things, they just go and mess people around. They're going to start a job that they don't start. Then they don't answer the phone. You see, I understand that on both sides of the coin here, there are two sides of the story. And there's many occasions that I've seen where an employer themselves has been out of order, that has been the villain in it, they've been the victim too. So whilst we found many examples of employers being about as reasonable as Ted Bundy in a college dormitory, we found just as many examples of employees being about as fair as a spoiled teenager complaining they only got £10 in their birthday card. So to sum up, I think 0-hour contracts work. I think they're a good idea. And I think as a concept, they have a place. But much in the same way that if you invited 100 people over to your house for a house party, you know that a few of them are going to take the piss. And that, in the same way as 0-hour contracts, is where things go wrong. If you like this video, give us a big thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click on the bell icon so you won't miss any one of our forthcoming videos.